Elisabetta Colla from Lisbon University School of Arts and Humanities. Give you some time to set up. And she's going to present on Shaman-shaped haniwa, religious practice, ritual landscape, and political power during the Kofun period of Japan.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like, of course, to thank the organizing committee for having accepted my paper. In 2008, I saw in a while Professor Willy van der Waal. I was helping in organizing the 19th annual conference for the same organization. And I would never imagine at that time that one day I could sit among leading experts on documentary and visual resources on Japan. Before going back to my topic and my communication, I would like to contextualize a little bit and explain why I'm here. Okay, good. I have a background as a sinologist. I do not speak Japanese language. I'm very sorry for that, although I'm able to somehow read it. I teach Arts of Asia at the School of Arts and Humanities of Lisbon University. And since a long time, I'm fond of the ancient history and prehistory of East Asia. I do not consider, as I told you, an expert on Japanese studies. This is why in 2019, I've come back to study Japanese language, and I've enrolled myself in a second PhD in prehistory and archaeology, centering my researches on anthropomorphic haniwa. You have a sample here of a book, which is very important for my thesis. And since in Portugal, we do not have access to specific program on Japanese archaeology, I have decided to study religious practice in Japan at SOAS and archaeology in practice, as well as ritual and religion in prehistory at Oxford University. The topic of my thesis focuses on the religious practice, ritual landscape, and political power during the Coffin period Japan. Developer research on the Coffin period in Japan raises many questions. One among others, maybe the most important, is the question of sources. Which kind of sources we can use when we are studying the proto-historical period, the Kofun period in Japan, which also implies some methodological issues. When I was writing the state of the art of my thesis, I have soon realized that most of the sources available on this topic were mainly written after the Kofun period. Therefore, besides Chinese sources on this period, one should mainly rely on the interpretation of archaeological evidences based on written documentation from the 8th century onwards. I will go back to Japan in 10 days from today. By the end of September, as you can see in the slide, I will be at the Shimane Museum of Ancient Izumo, working together with my colleagues in installing and mounting the B-Archeo final exhibition. In 2018, I was invited to join B-Archeo. B-Archeo is an international project financed by the European Union Horizon 2020. And I was honored to be part of a project designed to try out a transdisciplinary approach in the investigation of the Coffin period. And I was proud to be one of the few Europeans that could participate to the excavation of the Coffin. B-Archeo approach have required a notable interdisciplinary collaboration among numerous disciplines and innovative planning, excavation, and research procedures. Field excavations of the Tobyotsuka Kofun have been possible thanks to the support of the Okayama Prefecture, and a special acknowledgement is also to the Shimane Prefecture for providing the archaeological finds for scientific investigation and for hosting the B-Archeo final exhibition in Shimane Museum of Ancient Izumo between October and December 2022. After this long, and I hope not so boring, introduction, but the necessary contextualization, let's go back to the topic of my presentation, Shaman-shaped haniwa, question mark, religious practice, ritual landscape, and political power during the Coffin period in Japan. The reason why I put a question mark after shaman-shaped haniwa is because what is generally labeled as shaman-shaped haniwa could actually be a specialist in a religious practice, and also we should consider that during Kofun period, shaman also played a key role as political leader, as in the case of Himiko or Pimiko, the shaman queen, well described in the Chinese sources, such as, for instance, the Wager Chronicle of Wei, and of which we have also some researches done in English language. The reign of Himiko corresponds to the appearance of the famous keyhole-shaped tombs, which actually is not the translation of Kofun, but this is the way how the Western audience label the rear round front square tomb, old tomb. The reign of Pimiko also marked the beginning, of course, of the Kofun period, and haniwa in general, and specifically anthropomorphic haniwa, are valuable visual resources on Japan, taking into consideration the situation of sources about Kofun period in Japan and the fact that writing itself was basically introduced in Japan after the Kofun period. The Kofun period in Japan was characterized by the advent of this monumental tomb, Kofun, old ancient tomb, which also marks the beginning of class society as tomb size increased in the 3rd century from 100 meter to 280 meter in length. So we have an increase in the size of the Kofun of these mounded tombs. As you can see in the table, sorry. As you can see in the table, yes. As you can see in the table, the Kofun period spans roughly from the 3rd to the 8th century AD and witnessed, according to later sources, the formation of the first Japanese state, Yamato, not to be confounded with Yamatai, and the emergence of court society. However, the road was not straight. Shifts in capitals, regimes, continental partners, and internal character define 3 phases in this trajectory, with the Chinese influence predominant eventually in the early Coffin period and interaction with the peninsular societies dominant in the middle and late Kofun periods. Writing and Buddhism were adopted from the continent around the 5th, 6th centuries, while Chinese style temple and palaces architecture revolutionized elite settlement and religious practices. Kofun period concluded and the succeeding Nara period in the 8th century. That is the period when one assisted to the submission of the first histories to the Nara court, the Kojiki de Nihon Shoki, for instance. These documents extend back into late Yayoi and Kofun periods, together with the Chinese court histories. They make, of course, these periods protohistoric in nature. Haniwa. Haniwa, the customs of placing Haniwa, you saw a sample of Haniwa, anthropomorphic Haniwa, beside the book on Himiko a while ago. So Haniwa, the custom of placing earthware, grave furniture, or Haniwa on the exteriors of the mound began on the late of the Yayoi period with the use of decorative ceramics, stand, and vessels especially in the Okayama region, where I have the pleasure to be before pandemic, and now I will go back in few weeks. In the early Kofun period, cylindrical or ento Haniwa were set in arrangement and form the middle Kofun period, a diverse array of forms, including replicas of houses, as you can see, houses, umbrellas, quivers, and other forms of Haniwa. Haniwa, or anthropomorphic Haniwa, or Haniwa in the human shape, were produced a little bit later. And the idea of representing humans must have been introduced from the continent, eventually China, to the Kawachi area, which is very close to today's Osaka. In fact, we can quote, for instance, the mausoleum of the famous first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi, who in fact included a lot of terracotta warriors and other figures, anthropomorphic figures, inside his mausoleum. Haniwa are placed outside the tomb. However, in the case of Japan, one should note that, as I was telling a while ago, Haniwa were placed on the exterior surface and boundaries of the tombs, rather than inside as it happened in China. And here we do have a sample of tubular cylindrical ento Haniwa, which is from the Okayama Museum. And I thank Vittorio Laura for the picture and the 3D elaboration of this picture. Both tubular and figurative Haniwa had cylindrical base, maybe we can shift to the other, sorry. To the other slide. So as you see, both cylindrical and anthropomorphic, zoomorphic, phytomorphic, or other haniwa representing object, they generally have a cylindrical base, which is a setting ground, and gave in protohistoric period a certain stability to this object on the top of the mound. And although the top portion of each haniwa collapsed long ago, shards remain on the mound surface, and remains of the base can be seen with minimal clearing. And I could testify it with my own eyes. The chronology of haniwa is based on 4 sets of attributes: scraping of the surface, external ridge, natural firing, and the shape and location of the perforation. So these are some of the elements that help the archaeologists to date these haniwa. And here we have some sample. I just quick go through the sample. I'm sorry for the Japanese. Eventually you can find some mistakes, but I already warned the audience that my Japanese is very weak. This is a house-shaped haniwa. Actually, they are called house-shaped, but they can eventually also represent some sort of temple. But okay, there is a lot of theories around this. And my anthropomorphic haniwa, in the sense that this is the focus of my PhD thesis. On your left, the first one, the one that seems to shake the hands, is a sumo wrestler. Very, very interesting. And then we have all kinds and different sort of anthropomorphic haniwa, which are in fact very, very important to study this period, the Coffin period. The haniwa chronology, of course, and shape and form allows the archaeologist to assign rough dates to an excavated tombs. And as far as the Kofun is concerned, is very important because Kofun is considered a sacred burial, of course, and most of the coffin cannot be excavated actually. So the fact of finding on the surface haniwa can help the archaeologist to give an approximate datation to the coffin. From the 5th century, this haniwa has begun to appear in the anthropomorphic form and also in zoomorphic form. Most large mounds had an arrangement of haniwa in form of circle. And if you analyze the word haniwa means in circle. With the square on the summit and a circle on the rear mound, which represents somehow a cosmological settlement, which can go back to the continent, China, or eventually other interpretation that can be applied to the fact that the circle represents the sky, the heaven, and the square, the earth. So there are many interpretations that could be given to this distribution of haniwa. The placement of haniwa on the round mound was one of the final steps in the burial ritual, which began with the keeping of the deceased in a special structure, mogari, prior to the burial. Vessel for food and drink, model houses for temporary response of the spirit, and the symbols of ranks such as haniwa umbrella, sword, quivers, and shields could also be used in the same burial. To conclude, I hope I'm just keeping the time. Early Japan, of course, can be studied, can be researched, can be analyzed in two Chinese chronicles. I'm referring especially the Kofun period Japan, among which the Sengoju is the most important. Within the Sengoju, we have the Weiju, another chronicle, the chronicle of the Wei reign is very important for Japan, especially for the beginning of the Kofun period. And then we have the Hohanshu, the chronicle of the later Han. But of course, these Chinese sources give a perspective, an outsider, a perspective on the Kofun period. There are other sources, such as, for instance, other Chinese chronicle, the Sui and the Tang chronicle, the Sui and Tang Shu, the dynastic chronicles. But in the case of the Sui and Tang Shu, we have a very few indication on the Kofun period. And most of the information that we find in these Chinese chronicles is a repetition of what we already find in the Weiju. There are texts, so they are texts with less content on the so-called Tungyi, Eastern barbarians, of course. As far as the written sources on Kofun period in Japan, beside the already mentioned, aforementioned Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, why not do mention also the Mayonshu with the famous banka, these funerary elegies, very important for this period, but also the Fudoki. There is a beautiful example of an 8th century Fudoki in the Izumo Museum, in the Shimane Museum, but it is 8th century. They provide, of course, a rare glimpse into daily life. I'm specifically talking about Fudoki. We have very few extant Fudoki. And the Arima Fudoki was recently translated and published by Brill. So you can easily, I mean, those who don't speak Japanese can easily have access to this Fudoki in translation too. So they provide a right glimpse into daily life in ancient Kunin, these regions, among other details. The text contains extensive lists of local agricultural and marine products, especially in the Izumo Fudoki. But the problem is that these sources are actually provide a, let's say, a later retrospective on Kofun period. And in the case of the Chinese sources, as I told you, they give and they provide an external and very specific perspective on the Kofun period. Therefore, luckily, we have other kind of sources that can provide us an idea about the Kofun period, how Kofun people could live, wear, dress, and some of the ritual connected to the Kofun period people. Therefore, the Haniwa, as well as other visual resources. I'm thinking about famous murals found inside famous Kofun. They represent a really precious source of information to reconstruct the religious practice, ritual landscape, and political power during the Coffin period in Japan. So I have concluded my presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to open the floor for questions. Yes, in the back there. Microphone is on its way.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a very general question, just to clarify maybe a broad thing. You mentioned that excavation of coffins is quite a complicated matter because of the sacredness, and there are places out of limit. Who sets these limits, and what do you define where you can excavate or not? And do you think how much that restricts the whole knowledge about coffin, or do you feel that you gain this kind of slice that is representing the whole thing, or you think that many things are still missing? Maybe it's a very big question, but briefly, if you can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question. Japan sets the limits, of course. As far as the Tobetsuka Kofun is concerned, was a very minor satellite Kofun, which is part of a larger group of Kofun. And the Western team, the Western archaeologists, were allowed to excavate this small Kofun, because in fact it was a very minor Kofun that indeed it was already excavated and looted in past time. Japan set the limits. The agency in charge of heritage sets the limit of these excavations. Huge Kofun such as those you can find in Osaka or Nara regions, of course, and were not excavated. Although if we go back in time, Edo time, we do have some, especially in Tokugawa period, we do have some leading scholars, Japanese leading scholars, who did the mapping of these coffins. So before World War II, very important. And this is one thing. And the other thing, so we have some data provided by leading scholars, such as scholars who belonged to the Mito school. And then in the 19th century, there were some scholars from England, for instance. I'm remembering about Goland, that had the opportunity to enter Kofun, excavate some Kofun, but during the 19th century. And this means very short before the rules that established that Kofun could no longer be excavated, that they were sacred, and of course, especially Western archaeologists were not anymore allowed to participate in any kind of archaeological excavation of this kind, especially referring to the Coffin period. Again, is Japan, is their country, they decide. Okay, so I don't know if I answered your question, but.
Yes, yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for interesting presentation. I have a very short question. Actually, only very, very recently, coffins were enlisted in UNESCO, finally. It was a very long strive for Japan to get those Kofuns in the list. How do you think, being Kofuns in the UNESCO Heritage List, will it change the rules of conservation, research, and other related procedures? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. This is also a very interesting question. Of course, I don't have the answer myself. I can imagine what can happen anyway. This is like all the movement, all the practices, all the processes are going around the fact of decolonizing, for instance, museums. So it's more or less in the same trend. I don't know what will happen. What I believe is that eventually Japanese archaeologists will start to excavate, dig, and looking into Kofun, if the rules will change, of course, because big Kofun cannot be excavated so far. And eventually, at the final stage of excavation, they can eventually ask the support. They don't need anyway, but they can eventually ask the support of Western archaeologists. But I really don't know. I really don't know. But of course, since they became UNESCO heritage, they should be open to the world, because and open to the world means also to preserve them, because becoming a UNESCO heritage means also to be preserved, So outside and inside, but I don't know, really don't know. Maybe somebody in the audience can give you a better answer on this topic.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question, if there is any from the audience. If not, I would like to thank you again for your wonderful presentation.
I thank you for the question. Thank you.